Leaders' questions under Standing Order 36. So, Sinn Féin Doherty.
Tánas ar máidín na Mic Léinn muid an déil seáinniu agus iad agaid mar go bhfuil siad ag stapu in Ástan, bia agus leapa agus iad marú óige. Agus na Mic Léinn eile ag taiseal ar bhuireanta fada ga eile le óna tithe héin iad isteagadín ceithir ar máidín agus ar ais tróna. Agus níos más a ríist na Mic Léinn ag bogu ó talag go talag a hanaithe. Agus an ceiste tugann na cwoi iméis jeru ar an scanal seo. Tánaiste, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to be affected by the stories we heard this week from the countless families and the individuals who have been failed by your housing policy. From the stories of the Micah families who continue to campaign for 100% redress, as literally their homes are crumbling around them, to the stories of the students who told us how what should have been one of the proudest moments, one of the most exciting moments for any student going off to college has turned into a nightmare for many of them because they can't meet the most basic of needs, that is finding a place to live. And yesterday, Tánaiste, I'm not sure if you heard it, but the harrowing stories that were told by those further on in years. On Lifeline, we heard the reality of a broken system laid bare. We heard of Sandra, a woman in her 50s. She shared her story with us. In tears, she said she couldn't afford the rent and is living in a shed with no running water. She said she felt ashamed, Tánaiste. She said there is no hope. But the only people who should feel ashamed, Tánaiste, are the people sitting on that side of this house, are the people on those benches who have presided over a situation where people today are living in sheds with no running water. This is a crisis that is ruining people's lives. It is absolutely devastating. It's a crisis now that impacts on every citizen right across the state, from the cradle to the grave. And as we meet here this afternoon outside the gates of Leinster House, students are protesting due to the lack of student accommodation. Many of them are staying in hotels, in B&Bs, in hostels, paying crazy prices. Others are commuting the long distance from home to college every single day, with many, many more of them going from home to home, house to house, couch to couch, with a rucksack on their back and a sleeping bag under their arm. And it's having a profound effect on access to education, and it particularly disadvantages people from rural communities. Tánaiste, it's ridiculous and an unsustainable situation. But it's been a situation that has been well flagged to you and your government and previous governments for many years. And it's a situation that's been made worse as a result of the provision of tax breaks to those who were supposed to provide purpose-built student accommodation, only for many of those units to be now repurposed into tourist accommodation. And yet you'll trot out, as you've been doing in the media, about Fine Gael wanting to see tax cuts in this budget, while at the same time people like Sandra can't put a roof over their head. While there's 1,000 students in Waterford that don't have a home, and students right across the state can't find accommodation. But your priorities are clear. So can I ask you, Tánaiste, this? Do you accept that your housing policies have failed young and old spectacularly? And please, when you answer that question, listen to the stories and the voices that we heard over this week, from Micah families to students, to people like Sandra and other women. Do you accept, as the president of DCU said today, that your Housing for All plan are uneconomic, based on false assumptions, and would only result in rents that are beyond the ability to pay for most students and families? And will you, Tánaiste, as an immediate measure, do as our spokesperson for higher education has been calling on your government to do, Rose Conway-Walsh, where she has asked many months ago to legislate to prevent purpose-built student accommodation being repurposed into tourist accommodation?
Thanks very much, Deputy. There are a lot of threads to your question there, and I think perhaps I'll focus my reply on the issue of student accommodation in recognition of the fact that there will be a student protest today on that particular issue. I think students have suffered a lot in this pandemic. They've seen changes to the Leaving Cert cancelled, calculated grades. Many have had to experience college from home, from a bedroom or a box room. No sports, no societies, no ability to socialise in a normal way. We are now entering a new phase of the pandemic, and because of that, it's possible for students to go back on campus. And I think that's something everyone in this House will welcome. But of course, it does bring back into sharp focus the issue of student accommodation and the shortage thereof. It's something that the government is very much aware of, the challenges that students face as they return to third level. We've responded by increasing the Student Assistance Fund. And on accommodation, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the availability of bed spaces in on-campus accommodation. With the exception of NUI Galway, shared rooms are not being offered this year because of concerns around COVID. And this removes the most affordable option available in most universities and also decreases the number of places available. There's also evidence that fewer people are willing to offer digs than was the case in previous years. And both of these things have contributed to the shortage this year. The Department of Housing and Further and Higher Education have been engaging on a number of issues, including the use of privately owned student accommodation being used for other purposes, and this is contrary to the student accommodation strategy. Government has also taken on measures in relation to affordability. As you know, the cost of student accommodation is capped under the rent pressure zones, and in addition, Minister Bryan has passed legislation to restrict upfront payments that students used to be asked to pay. So previously, a student or their family was asked to pay a lump sum each term of €2,500, €3,500. Thankfully, that is now gone. Students also have the option to pay monthly, and that's lowering the upfront payment costs required for student accommodation, and we think that can help against losses such as those suffered by students. And in addition, under Housing for All, ministers have now secured government approval to allow the new technological universities to borrow to build student accommodation, which I think will increase availability a lot. And one of the things that we need to see, it has been happening, but it needs to happen more and faster, is universities and technological universities building on-campus student accommodation on a cost rental basis, providing more options for students to live on campus or near campus with affordable rents.
Taoiseach, this isn't just a COVID story. There have been students down throughout the years that have been in tents, that have been in hotels, that have been in B&Bs and in hostels. But we have a housing crisis right across society. And I laid that out to you, from the Micah families to the women who we heard yesterday. Those devastating, I don't know if you heard it, Taoiseach, but you should listen to what they've said. And can I make this point? I believe that this has happened because you have looked at homes as an investment. You have looked at homes as a potential profit margin for investors or for individuals, as opposed to looking through the prism of securing a roof over somebody's head, whether it is the student, whether it's the women in the 50s, or indeed whether it is the Micah families who have had to take their campaign to the streets. Taoiseach, you talk about your plans on Housing for All. You're not listening. The DCU president has said very clear, uneconomic, based on false assumptions, and would only result in rents that are beyond the ability to pay for most students and families. There are immediate things that you can do. Over a third of all purpose-built student accommodation, which get tax breaks and planning for student accommodations, are going into tourist accommodation. Will you introduce the legislation that we have been calling for, in particular Rose Conway Walsh, to stop that in its tracks? And will you provide the capital for the state to build the necessary units?
Thanks, Deputy. The Minister will give consideration to any legislation that's brought forward by the opposition. Deputy, I'm very aware that we face a housing crisis in this country, and I'm very aware of the many personal stories. You don't have a monopoly on compassion or understanding, Deputy. You may think you do, but you don't. Everyone in this House has constituents. Everyone in this House has friends and family, and everyone in this House can recount plenty of personal stories as to how people have been impacted by the housing crisis, whether it's high rents, whether it's the difficulty finding a place to buy, whether it's the many other issues which you've mentioned. And that's why we have Housing for All, the biggest investment in social housing ever in the history of the state. And that's why we have cost rental now for the first time. It's why we've brought in a rent freeze in real terms, linking rent increases to inflation. It's why we're doing so many. It's why we're doing so many of those things, Deputy. But you said earlier on that the people on these benches, on the government benches, should be ashamed. Maybe you should ask yourself whether you should be ashamed too. Your party voted to increase rents in Northern Ireland in a pandemic. There is never, you never miss, and you've been
lying in their sheds
Deputy,
without running water, and you
Deputy,
should be ashamed. And a bit of humility from you would go a long way.
And a bit of humility from you too would go a long way. Last Concordia with the usual display, truth hurt, they go mad, drives them crazy. They increased rents in Northern Ireland. They never miss an opportunity to oppose housing here in the South. Never.
Would you listen listen to the voices of the people. Forget about what we're saying. Listen to them, Taoiseach, and a bit of humility, and maybe look at it through the prism of the individuals as opposed to the landlords
Deputy
and
Doherty.
speculators who you are always
Deputy
under fire.
Doherty, you had 4 minutes to put a question,
That's
and
the
you had a
reality.
minute to put a
The
question.
truth hurts.
Taoiseach,
The truth hurts. Listen to Liveline.
when
Listen
the
to
two
Liveline
gentlemen,
yesterday.
when the two gentlemen are acting in a most ungentlemanly fashion, finish. Could you please have a little respect for the last Corla? Thank you very much. And if you're going to use my name, could you please listen to the response? Thank you. We're going to stick to the times.